When successful businessman Will Smith saw his housekeeper of 8 years carefully counting crumpled dollar bills in his kitchen at 11 p.m., whispering desperately into her phone in Spanish, he never imagined that following her home would reveal a truth so devastating it would change his entire perspective on what it truly means to be rich. Before we dive into this heart-wrenching story, I'd love to know where you're watching from today. Drop your location in the comments below, hit that like button, and if you're new here, subscribe to hear more stories about the moments that remind us what really matters in life. Now let me take you back to how it all began. Will Smith wasn't the Hollywood actor you might think of, but he was certainly living a life that many would envy. At 45, this Los Angeles-based tech entrepreneur had built his software company from a cramped garage to a sprawling downtown office with over 200 employees. His Bel Air mansion sat on 3 acres of perfectly manicured gardens, complete with an infinity pool that seemed to spill into the city lights below. Every morning, Will would wake up in his master suite, larger than most people's entire apartments, to the aroma of fresh Colombian coffee and homemade breakfast. The credit for this daily luxury went to Maria Santos, a quiet woman in her early 40s, who had been keeping his household running smoothly for the past 8 years. Maria was the kind of employee every busy executive dreams of having. She arrived precisely at 6 a.m. every weekday, worked with an efficiency that was almost magical, and maintained such a low profile that Will's friends often forgot he even had household staff. She would glide through the house like a ghost, leaving everything spotless and organized, speaking only when spoken to, and always with a respectful, "Yes, Mr. Smith," or, "Of course, Mr. Smith." Will prided himself on being a good employer. He paid Maria well above the average rate for housekeepers in Los Angeles, $25 an hour, plus generous bonuses during holidays. He never raised his voice, always said, "Please" and "Thank you," and even gave her 2 weeks paid vacation every year. In his mind, he was treating her fairly, maybe even generously, but if Will was being completely honest with himself, he knew almost nothing about Maria as a person. He knew she was originally from El Salvador, that she was incredibly reliable, and that she made the best tamales he'd ever tasted during Christmas time. Beyond that, Maria Santos remained a mystery, a competent, trustworthy mystery who made his privileged life even more comfortable. That was exactly how Will preferred it. His world was compartmentalized, efficient and uncomplicated. Maria belonged to the category of household management, filed away neatly in his organized mind, alongside his gardener, pool cleaner, and security system. Personal lives were personal, business was business, and everything had its proper place. Little did Will know that this comfortable distance he maintained was about to be shattered in the most unexpected way possible. It started with the phone calls. Will first noticed them about 3 weeks ago, during one of his rare work-from-home days. He was in his home office, struggling through a particularly difficult conference call with investors in Tokyo, when he heard Maria's voice coming from the kitchen, not her usual quiet murmur, but something urgent and strained. She was speaking rapid Spanish, her voice tight with what sounded like worry, maybe even fear. Will didn't speak Spanish fluently, but he caught fragments. Hospital, dinero, money, and por favor, please, repeated several times. The conversation lasted nearly 20 minutes, far longer than Maria had ever spent on personal calls during work hours. When Will emerged from his office, he found Maria standing by the kitchen sink, staring out the window with red-rimmed eyes. She quickly composed herself when she saw him, offering her usual polite smile and asking if he needed anything for lunch. But something in her expression had changed. There was a heaviness there that hadn't been present before. Over the following days, Will found himself paying closer attention to Maria in ways he never had before. It was like suddenly noticing cracks in a wall that had always been there, but somehow invisible until now. Her usually pristine uniform was showing signs of wear, small tears carefully mended, colors slightly faded from too many washings. Her shoes, which he'd never really looked at before, were worn down at the heels and splitting slightly at the seams. Most telling of all were the phone calls, which became more frequent and increasingly desperate. Maria would step outside to take them, pacing back and forth on the back patio while speaking in hushed, urgent tones. Through the window, Will could see her free hand pressed against her forehead, her shoulders curved inward like someone carrying an invisible weight. One evening, as Will was working late in his study, he heard Maria in the kitchen well past her usual departure time of 6 p.m. Curious, he quietly made his way toward the sound, and found her sitting at his kitchen island, carefully counting a small pile of crumpled bills and coins under the warm pendant lighting. She was organizing them by denomination, smoothing out each wrinkled dollar bill with the same meticulous care she applied to his expensive dress shirts. The sight struck him as oddly intimate and profoundly sad. Here was a woman he saw every day, in his own home, counting what appeared to be every penny she possessed. The bills weren't crisp from an ATM. They were the kind of worn, soft currency that gets passed from hand to hand countless times, the kind that comes from tips, small cash jobs, and careful saving. Maria must have sensed his presence because she looked up suddenly, startled. For just a moment, her carefully maintained professional mask slipped, and Will saw something raw and desperate in her eyes, the look of someone drowning who's trying very hard not to splash. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Smith," she said quickly, sweeping the money into her purse. I'll be leaving now." "Maria, wait," Will started to say, but she was already gathering her things, moving with the practiced efficiency of someone who had learned not to take up space or time that wasn't explicitly given to her. "Is everything all right?" he asked, though the question felt inadequate even as he spoke it. "Yes, of course, Mr. Smith. Everything is fine. I'll see you tomorrow morning." But as Will watched her walk toward the back exit, he noticed something that would haunt him for days afterward. Maria's hands were shaking as she fumbled with the door handle, and she paused for just a moment with her forehead pressed against the glass, taking a deep breath as if gathering strength for whatever waited for her outside his comfortable, protected world. That night, Will couldn't concentrate on his usual evening routine of reading financial reports and answering emails. Instead, he found himself wondering about Maria's life beyond his manicured property lines. Where did she go when she left his house? What was waiting for her in those phone calls? And why did counting those worn dollar bills look like the most important task in the world? For the first time in 8 years, Will Smith realized he knew nothing about the woman who knew everything about his daily life, and that ignorance was beginning to feel less like privacy and more like willful blindness. The decision to follow Maria wasn't premeditated. Will told himself later that it had been pure impulse, a moment of curiosity that got the better of him. But if he was being completely honest, the truth was more complex than that. For 3 days after the kitchen incident, he had watched Maria move through his house like someone carrying an invisible burden, and his comfortable ignorance had transformed into something that felt dangerously close to guilt. It was a Thursday evening when everything changed. Will had finished his work earlier than usual and was in his living room, pretending to read a quarterly report while actually watching Maria through the floor-to-ceiling windows as she gathered her belongings from the kitchen. The late afternoon California sun cast long shadows across his property, and Maria moved through them like a figure in a melancholy painting. As she walked toward the bus stop at the end of his street, something Will had never really thought about before, he found himself grabbing his car keys. His rational mind tried to intervene. "This is inappropriate. This is crossing a line. This isn't your business." But a stronger voice, one that had been growing louder each day, whispered back, 8 years, and you don't even know how she gets home." Will waited until Maria's bus had pulled away before starting his silver BMW. Following a city bus turned out to be easier than he'd expected. The stops were frequent, the route predictable, but with each mile they traveled east, away from the manicured lawns and Mediterranean-style mansions of Bel Air. Will felt like he was descending into a different world entirely. The scenery changed gradually, then dramatically. Luxury car dealerships gave way to auto repair shops with hand-painted signs. Boutique coffee shops became corner markets with barred windows. The palm trees were still there, but they looked different somehow. Less decorative, more functional, casting shadows over sidewalks cracked by time and neglect rather than perfectly maintained walking paths. Will had lived in Los Angeles his entire adult life, but he realized with growing unease that he had never really seen this part of the city. His daily route took him from Bel Air to downtown via the freeway, a carefully curated journey that never required him to witness how the other half, or in LA's case the other 90%, actually lived. The bus finally stopped in an area that Will's GPS unhelpfully labeled as East Los Angeles, though the neighborhood felt like it could have been in a completely different country. Small houses with bars on the windows sat next to vacant lots filled with weeds. Bright murals decorated the sides of buildings, bringing splashes of color to streets that seemed drained of everything else vibrant. Will parked his BMW a block away, suddenly very conscious of how much his car cost compared to everything else he could see, and continued on foot. He felt like an intruder, overdressed in his tailored shirt and Italian leather shoes, walking through a neighborhood where every face told a story of struggle he had never had to write. Maria walked with purpose through these streets, clearly familiar with every turn. She stopped briefly at a small market, exchanging rapid Spanish with the elderly man behind the counter as she purchased what looked like basic groceries: bread, milk, rice, beans. Nothing fancy, nothing extra, just the essentials. From the market, she walked another 4 blocks to what Will initially thought was a parking lot. But as he got closer, he realized it was something he had heard about but never actually seen: a trailer park. Not the kind of place he'd imagined from movies, but a real community of people making homes out of whatever they could afford. The trailers were old but well-maintained, many decorated with small gardens or colorful decorations that spoke of people trying to create beauty and dignity in circumstances that offered precious little of either. Children's toys were scattered in small yards, and the sound of multiple languages floated through the air, along with the smell of various cuisines cooking in compact kitchens. Maria approached a pale blue trailer that sat toward the back of the small community. Even from his hiding spot behind a rusty pickup truck, Will could see that she paused before opening the door, taking that same deep breath he had noticed in his kitchen, as if preparing herself for whatever waited inside. As she reached for the door handle, Will heard something that made his blood run cold: the sound of a child crying, not with the typical frustration of childhood, but with a deeper distress that spoke of pain beyond scraped knees or hurt feelings. Maria disappeared inside the trailer, and for a moment the crying stopped. But Will remained frozen in place, beginning to understand that he was about to witness something that would fundamentally change how he saw not just Maria, but himself and the comfortable bubble he had built around his entire life. The truth was waiting just beyond that pale blue door, and Will Smith was about to discover that sometimes the most devastating revelations come not from dramatic confrontations or shocking betrayals, but from simply seeing how the people we think we know actually live when we're not watching. What Will saw through the small uncurtained window of that pale blue trailer would be seared into his memory for the rest of his life. At first his eyes struggled to adjust to the dim interior, but gradually the scene came into heartbreaking focus. Maria was kneeling beside a narrow bed, gently stroking the hair of a boy who appeared to be around 12 years old. The child's limbs were twisted at unnatural angles, his small body contorted by what Will would later learn was severe cerebral palsy. But it wasn't the physical condition that devastated Will. It was the love that radiated from every movement Maria made as she cared for her son. She spoke to him in soft Spanish, her voice carrying a tenderness that Will had never heard in all their years of professional interaction. She carefully adjusted his position, checked what appeared to be some kind of feeding tube, and began the process of giving him medication from a collection of prescription bottles that crowded the small nightstand. The trailer was smaller than Will's walk-in closet, maybe 200 square feet total, but it was meticulously clean and organized. Every inch of space had been maximized for function. Medical equipment shared space with a tiny kitchenette, and Maria had created a small altar in one corner with candles and photographs, pictures of her son as a baby before the condition had fully manifested, and images of what Will assumed were deceased family members watching over them from gilded frames. As Maria worked, she counted pills carefully, rationing them as if each one was precious beyond measure. Will watched her divide medications into a weekly pill organizer, and even from outside, he could see that some compartments remained partially empty. She was stretching the prescriptions, making them last longer than they should, because she couldn't afford to refill them as often as her son needed them. The boy, her son, seemed to recognize her presence despite his condition. His eyes, bright and intelligent in a face that struggled with muscle control, followed her movements with an awareness that spoke of a mind trapped in a body that wouldn't obey. When Maria leaned down to kiss his forehead, he made soft sounds that weren't quite words, but were clearly attempts at communication. "I know, mijo," Maria whispered in English, perhaps for his benefit since many special needs programs taught bilingual children to communicate in both languages. "Mama's here now. Mama's going to take care of you." Will found himself gripping the side of the trailer for support as the full weight of his discovery crashed over him. For 8 years, Maria had been serving him breakfast, cleaning his mansion, organizing his privileged life, and then coming home to this. Every day, every single day. The phone calls suddenly made perfect sense. The careful counting of money, the worn clothes and mended uniform, the red eyes and barely contained desperation. Maria wasn't just working to support herself. She was working to keep her disabled son alive, and from what Will could see, it was a battle she was losing. The medical equipment in the trailer was clearly second-hand, patched and repatched to keep functioning. The boy's wheelchair, folded in the corner, was held together with duct tape and determination. There were medical bills stacked on the small table, and even from outside, Will could see the red past due stamps that covered most of them. As he watched, Maria prepared what appeared to be a feeding tube supplement, carefully measuring out powdered nutrition with the precision of a pharmacist. Every movement spoke of a routine practiced countless times, a mother who had become nurse, therapist, and advocate out of pure necessity and unwavering love. The boy began to struggle with what seemed to be a seizure, his small body tightening with spasms that Maria clearly recognized. She moved with practiced calm, positioning him carefully, timing the episode, offering comfort without panic. This too was routine. This too was part of the reality she carried with her every day as she polished Will's marble countertops and folded his designer shirts. When the seizure passed, Maria sat back on her heels and allowed herself a moment of exhaustion. Just a moment. Will watched her shoulders sag, watched her press her hands to her face, watched her allow herself 30 seconds of the despair she never permitted herself to show anywhere else. Then she stood up, smoothed her hair, and began preparing what looked like dinner from the simple groceries she had purchased: rice, beans, and a small piece of chicken that she cut carefully, making sure most of it would be pureed for her son, while she took only the smallest portion for herself. Will backed away from the window, his legs unsteady, his chest tight with an emotion he couldn't name. He stumbled toward his car, his mind reeling with the implications of what he had witnessed. Every interaction with Maria over the past 8 years began to replay in his memory, but now with devastating new context. Her reliability wasn't just professionalism, it was desperation. She couldn't afford to miss work, couldn't risk losing her job because her son's life literally depended on her income. Her quietness wasn't just respect for his privacy, it was the careful behavior of someone who knew she was completely expendable, that families like his could replace people like her without a second thought. As Will drove back toward Bel Air, the familiar route felt like traveling between planets. Every red light gave him another moment to process what he had seen, and by the time he reached his own neighborhood, one truth had crystallized with painful clarity. He had never actually known Maria Santos at all. He had known her function, her schedule, her professional skills. But Maria the mother, Maria the warrior fighting an impossible battle with grace and dignity, Maria the woman who somehow found the strength to be cheerful and reliable for him while her own world was quietly falling apart, that Maria had been invisible to him for 8 years, and now that he could see her, Will Smith wasn't sure he could ever unsee her again. That night, Will couldn't sleep. He lay in his king-sized bed, custom-made, worth more than many people's cars, staring at the ceiling while his mind replayed 8 years of interactions with Maria through this devastating new lens. He remembered the first day he'd hired her. The employment agency had sent over 3 candidates, all equally qualified on paper. But Maria had stood out for what he now realized were all the wrong reasons. She was the most deferential, the least likely to ask for time off, the one who seemed most grateful for the opportunity. He had chosen her because she seemed like she would be the least trouble. How many red flags had he missed? Will began cataloging them with the methodical precision he usually reserved for business analysis, and the list was staggering in its obviousness. There was the time, about 4 years ago, when Maria had asked for an advance on her salary. She had been so apologetic about it, so embarrassed, explaining that she had some unexpected expenses, and would it be possible to receive next week's pay early? Will had agreed easily enough. It was a reasonable request from a reliable employee, but he had never asked what the emergency was. Now he wondered, had her son been hospitalized? Had she been choosing between rent and medication? Then there were the holidays she had voluntarily worked when he'd offered her time off. Christmas Day, New Year's Eve, Easter Sunday. Maria had always politely declined his offers to give her the holidays off with pay. "If you don't mind, Mr. Smith, I prefer to work," she would say. Will had assumed she was just dedicated, maybe even preferred the quiet of working in an empty house. It had never occurred to him that she might need the overtime pay more than she needed rest. He thought about the countless times Maria had arrived at work, despite clearly being unwell. The morning she'd shown up with a fever, working through obvious exhaustion until Will had finally insisted she go home. The time she'd come to work with a wrist in a makeshift splint, explaining that she'd fallen but could still perform all her duties. The various cuts and bruises he'd noticed over the years, always accompanied by brief, dismissive explanations. Will had prided himself on being observant in business, on reading between the lines of financial reports and competitor analysis. But when it came to the woman who spent 40 hours a week in his home, he had been willfully blind. The most painful memory came rushing back with crystal clarity. It was about 2 years ago, during one of his dinner parties. Will had been entertaining some potential investors and their wives, showing off his house and his lifestyle as part of his pitch for their money. The evening had been going perfectly when one of the wives, a woman dripping in diamonds and condescension, had made a comment about Maria. "Oh, Will, your help is so well trained," she had said, watching Maria serve appetizers with quiet efficiency. "Where did you find her? My girl is so chatty and presumptuous. I keep telling my husband we need someone who knows their place." Will had felt uncomfortable with the comment, but he hadn't said anything. Instead, he had nodded politely and changed the subject to safer ground, stock portfolios and market predictions. He had let Maria's dignity be casually dismissed without a word of defense, without even the slightest acknowledgement that she was a human being deserving of respect. Now lying in his expensive bed, Will wondered if Maria had heard that conversation. Had she been in the kitchen, pretending not to listen while some stranger reduced her to the help and praised her for knowing her place? Had she gone home that night to her trailer and her sick son, carrying that small humiliation along with all her other burdens? The questions multiplied with each memory he examined. How many times had he discussed his problems, his challenges with employee retention, his frustrations with quarterly projections, his complaints about the city's traffic or the weather, while Maria quietly cleaned around him? How trivial must his concerns have sounded to a woman who was rationing her child's medication? Will thought about his own son, Marcus, who was away at Stanford studying business. Marcus, who had never wanted for anything, who complained when his monthly allowance was late, who had 3 cars to choose from when he came home for visits. Marcus, who would graduate debt-free and step into a management position at Will's company, who would never know what it meant to count crumpled dollar bills, or stretch prescriptions, or sleep in a 200-square-foot trailer. The contrast was devastating, but what made it worse was the realization that Will had never even asked Maria if she had children. In 8 years of employment, he had never shown enough basic human interest to learn this fundamental fact about her life. He knew the names of his business associates' kids, his neighbors' kids, his golf partners' kids. But Maria's son, the center of her universe, the reason for every sacrifice she made, had been completely unknown to him. Will got up and walked to his home office, where he kept personnel files. Maria's was thin, just the basic paperwork required for employment. Emergency contact, none listed. Family members, none listed. Medical insurance, she had declined the coverage he offered, saying she had other arrangements. Now he understood that she probably couldn't afford the employee contribution, even though his company plan would have been far superior to whatever she was managing on her own. As dawn broke over Los Angeles, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold that would have been beautiful under any other circumstances, Will Smith came to a realization that shattered him completely. He had been living in the same house as a woman who was quietly performing miracles of love and sacrifice every single day, and he had been too absorbed in his own comfortable world to notice. The shame was overwhelming, but beneath it was something else, a growing determination that felt different from any business decision he had ever made. This wasn't about profit margins or market share. This wasn't about corporate strategy or competitive advantage. This was about Maria Santos and her son, and the 8 years of blindness that Will was finally ready to bring to an end. Will didn't go to work the next day. For the first time in over a decade, he called his assistant and told her to cancel all his meetings, reschedule everything, and hold his calls. He couldn't bring himself to sit in boardrooms discussing quarterly projections and expansion strategies while Maria was arriving at his house, preparing his coffee, and pretending that her world wasn't quietly collapsing. Instead, he sat in his study, staring out at his infinity pool and manicured gardens, feeling like a stranger in his own life. The house suddenly felt obscenely large, ostentatiously comfortable. Every luxury seemed to mock him. The marble countertops that Maria polished until they gleamed, the Persian rugs she vacuumed with meticulous care, the crystal chandeliers she somehow cleaned without ever leaving a single water spot. When Maria arrived at 6 a.m. sharp, Will watched her from his window as she let herself in through the back entrance. She moved with her usual quiet efficiency, but now he could see the weight she carried in the slight slope of her shoulders, the careful way she conserved her energy for the long day ahead. He couldn't face her, not yet, not while his emotions were still so raw, so close to the surface. Instead, he retreated to his bedroom and listened to the familiar sounds of Maria beginning her daily routine, the gentle clink of coffee cups, the whisper of a broom across hardwood floors, the soft humming she sometimes allowed herself when she thought no one was listening. That humming broke him completely. It was a lullaby, he realized, a Spanish lullaby that she probably sang to her son every night. She was humming it while she worked in his kitchen, maybe thinking about the boy who was spending another day alone in that trailer, maybe finding comfort in the melody that connected her to him, even while she was miles away, earning the money that kept him alive. Will found himself crying for the first time since his father's funeral 15 years earlier. But these weren't tears of grief. They were tears of shame, of recognition, of a fundamental shift in how he understood his place in the world. He cried for the 8 years of opportunities he had missed to show basic human kindness. He cried for every time Maria had asked for nothing while giving everything. He cried for her son, fighting his battles in that tiny trailer while his mother cleaned the house of a man who could have changed everything with what amounted to pocket change. But mostly Will cried for himself, for the person he had been, for the moral blindness that had allowed him to live so close to such profound need while remaining completely oblivious to it. He had prided himself on being a good person, a fair employer, a contributing member of society. Now he saw that goodness wasn't just about not causing harm. It was about recognizing when you had the power to prevent it. Around noon, Will's phone began ringing insistently. His assistant, then his business partner, then several investors who needed decisions on time-sensitive deals. But he couldn't bring himself to care about any of it. The numbers that had once seemed so important, profit margins, stock prices, market projections, felt like abstract concepts from someone else's life. Instead, he did something he had never done before. He began researching, not stock options or merger opportunities, but cerebral palsy. He learned about the condition, the treatments, the equipment needed for home care. He researched the best pediatric neurologists in Los Angeles, the most advanced therapy programs, the costs of proper medical support. The numbers were staggering, but not in the way that business numbers usually staggered him. A top-tier specialist consultation, $2,000. Advanced physical therapy programs, $5,000 per month. Proper medical equipment for home care, $15,000 for a comprehensive setup. Medications that weren't fully covered by basic insurance, $3,000 per month. For Will, these numbers represented less than what he spent on wine in a typical month, less than he'd paid for the watch on his wrist, a fraction of what he'd dropped on his last vacation to Europe. For Maria, they represented impossible dreams, choices between rent and medicine, a constant calculus of survival that she performed every single day while maintaining her dignity and her son's quality of life. As the afternoon wore on, Will began to understand something that all his business education had never taught him. Wealth wasn't just about what you had, it was about what you could do with it. And for 8 years, he had been sitting on the power to transform lives while remaining completely unconscious of that responsibility. By evening, when Maria was preparing to leave, Will had made several phone calls, not to investors or clients, but to the best pediatric neurologist in Los Angeles, to a medical equipment company, to a home healthcare agency that specialized in pediatric care. He had learned more about cerebral palsy in one day than he had learned about any business topic in months, and every piece of information had reinforced the same devastating truth. Maria's son could have been getting better care, could have been more comfortable, could have had more opportunities, if only someone with resources had cared enough to provide them. As Maria gathered her things to leave, she paused by Will's study door. "Mr. Smith, are you feeling all right? You didn't come down for lunch today." The simple kindness in her voice, her concern for him, even as she carried her own overwhelming burdens, was almost too much to bear. "I'm fine, Maria, just thinking about some things." "Well, if you need anything tomorrow, just let me know. I made extra soup today, so there's plenty in the refrigerator." After she left, Will sat in his kitchen and ate the soup Maria had made. Simple, nourishing, prepared with the same care she brought to everything else. It was the best meal he'd had in months, not because of the ingredients, but because he was finally beginning to understand the love that had gone into preparing it. That night, Will Smith went to sleep as a different man than he had been when he woke up. The tears had washed away something that had been blocking his vision for 8 years, and now he could see clearly what he needed to do. The only question was whether he was brave enough to do it right. Will's plan had to be perfect. He had learned enough about Maria over the years to know that she was proud, dignified, and would likely refuse direct charity. Any approach that felt like pity or condescension would backfire, potentially costing Maria her job and making her situation even worse. He needed to find a way to help that would preserve her dignity while providing the medical care her son desperately needed. The solution came to him during a sleepless night of planning. It couldn't come from him directly. It had to appear to come from somewhere else, some stroke of luck or bureaucratic blessing that Maria could accept without feeling diminished. Will's first call was to Dr. Patricia Hernandez, the leading pediatric neurologist at Children's Hospital Los Angeles. He had researched her extensively. Not only was she considered one of the best in the country, but she was also known for her work with underserved communities and her fluency in Spanish. "Dr. Hernandez," Will said when he reached her office, "I want to discuss setting up a charitable foundation that would provide comprehensive care for children with cerebral palsy whose families can't afford private treatment." Dr. Hernandez was intrigued. "That's wonderful, Mr. Smith. We see so many families who struggle with the costs of proper care. What did you have in mind?" "I want to fund the complete treatment for one specific child to start, as a pilot program. A boy, about 12, severe cerebral palsy, currently receiving minimal care due to financial constraints. I want him to have access to everything, the best doctors, the best equipment, the best therapies, no expense spared." "That's incredibly generous. Do you have a particular patient in mind?" "Not exactly," Will lied smoothly, "but I'd like you to work with local community health centers to identify the most urgent cases. Start with East Los Angeles, perhaps around the trailer park communities. Look for a single mother, working multiple jobs, probably hasn't been able to afford proper neurological care." Dr. Hernandez was quiet for a moment. "Mr. Smith, I have to ask. This is remarkably specific. Are you sure you don't have a particular family in mind? Let's just say I've been made aware of how many families are struggling in silence. I want to start helping, but I need it done through proper medical channels. The family needs to believe they were selected through normal screening processes." The next call was to Michael Rodriguez, a social worker at the East LA Community Health Center who specialized in connecting families with resources. Will had found his name through the same research that led him to Dr. Hernandez. "Mr. Rodriguez, I represent a private foundation that's launching a pilot program for children with cerebral palsy. We're looking to provide comprehensive care for one family as a test case for a larger program we're developing." "What kind of comprehensive care are we talking about?" "Everything. Top-tier medical specialists, in-home nursing care, the best equipment available, medication costs covered, transportation to appointments, even modifications to the family's living space if needed. We want this to be a complete case study of what's possible when resources aren't a limiting factor." Michael was skeptical but interested. "This sounds too good to be true. What's the catch?" "No catch. Anonymous donor, very wealthy, recently lost a child to a neurological condition and wants to honor that child's memory by helping another family. The donor insists on complete anonymity and wants the selection to appear to come through normal social services channels. And you want me to identify families? I want you to look for the most deserving case you can find, single mothers especially, people who are working hard but still struggling with medical costs. Start with the trailer park communities in East LA. Look for someone who's been managing their child's care mostly on their own." The final piece of Will's plan required a bit more creativity. He contacted Elena Vasquez, a veteran social worker who had worked with immigrant families for over 20 years. Through careful questioning, he learned that she regularly conducted outreach in the exact trailer park where Maria lived. "Eleanor, I have a unique opportunity. A private benefactor wants to provide complete medical care for a child with special needs. The benefactor specifically requested that we find a family through community outreach rather than hospital referrals. That's unusual, but wonderful. What kind of timeline are we looking at?" "Immediate. The benefactor is eager to get started. I need you to prioritize families in your East LA routes, particularly around the Sunny Vista Trailer Park. Look for a woman named Maria. I don't have a last name, but she's probably in her 40s, works as a housekeeper, has a son with cerebral palsy. She's exactly the kind of person this program is designed to help." Elena paused. "Mr. Smith, You seem to know quite a bit about this particular family. Will took a deep breath. Let's say the benefactor has become aware of this situation through indirect channels. But it's crucial that the family believes they were selected through your normal screening process. This woman is proud, and she needs to feel like she's receiving help through legitimate channels, not charity. I think I understand. You want me to discover this family during my regular outreach. Exactly. And Eleanor, the funding is unlimited. Whatever this child needs, whatever would provide the best possible care and quality of life, make it happen. The benefactor's only request is complete anonymity. Over the next 3 days, Will orchestrated the most elaborate act of kindness he had ever attempted. He monitored every step of the process through his network of medical professionals and social workers, ensuring that everything appeared completely legitimate while being anything but coincidental. Eleanor made her routine visit to the Sunny Vista Trailer Park on a Wednesday morning, armed with information about new healthcare programs available to families with special needs children. When she knocked on the door of the pale blue trailer, she found exactly what Will had described. A woman in her 40s, clearly exhausted but maintaining her dignity, caring for a 12-year-old son with severe cerebral palsy in conditions that broke Eleanor's professional heart. Mrs. Santos, Elena had said, consulting her clipboard with practiced casualness. I'm Elena Vasquez from the County Health Services. I'm conducting outreach about some new programs that might benefit families with special needs children. Maria had been wary at first. Too many promises had been broken. Too many programs had waiting lists that lasted years. But Elena's genuine warmth and her fluent Spanish gradually lowered Maria's defenses. As they talked, Elena was able to assess the situation with the trained eye of someone who had seen it all. The improvised medical equipment, the carefully rationed medications, the love and dedication that were keeping this child alive despite impossible circumstances. Mrs. Santos, I'm going to be honest with you, Elena had said after meeting Maria's son, Diego. I've been doing this work for 20 years, and I've rarely seen a child who would benefit more from our new comprehensive care program. Would you be willing to let me submit Diego's case for review? The selection process was expedited in ways that would have seemed miraculous if Maria had known how these things typically worked. Dr. Hernandez personally reviewed Diego's case within 24 hours, a process that usually took months. The approval came through the next day, along with authorization for services that most families could never dream of accessing. Michael Rodriguez had called Maria personally to deliver the news. Mrs. Santos, I have remarkable news about Diego's application for comprehensive care services. Your son has been approved for our pilot program, which means he'll have access to the finest pediatric neurology care in Los Angeles, completely covered by our foundation funding. Maria had been quiet for so long that Michael had wondered if the connection had been lost. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. Are you certain? There hasn't been some mistake? No mistake, Mrs. Santos. Diego will be seen by Dr. Patricia Hernandez at Children's Hospital next week. All of his medications will be covered. We'll provide transportation to appointments, and we'll be setting up home healthcare support. There's also funding for any equipment or home modifications that would improve his quality of life. That evening, as Maria worked in Will's kitchen, he noticed something different about her. She moved with the same quiet efficiency, but there was something lighter in her step, something that looked dangerously close to hope in her expression. When she thought Will was out of earshot, he heard her make a phone call in rapid, excited Spanish. Even without understanding most of the words, he could hear the joy and disbelief in her voice as she shared the incredible news with someone, probably a relative or friend, who had been watching Diego during these miraculous days of medical appointments and evaluations. The first real test of Will's plan came 3 days later, when Maria approached him with obvious nervousness. Mr. Smith, I need to ask you something, and I hope you won't think badly of me for asking. Will looked up from his breakfast, trying to appear casually interested, rather than intensely invested in whatever she was about to say. Of course, Maria. What is it? My son has been accepted into a special medical program, and they want me to bring him for appointments during some of my work hours. I was wondering if perhaps I could adjust my schedule slightly. I could work earlier or later to make up the time, of course. The fact that she was still worried about her job, still prioritizing his convenience, even in the face of this life-changing opportunity for her son, nearly broke Will's heart all over again. Maria, he said carefully, that sounds like wonderful news about your son. Of course we can adjust your schedule. In fact, why don't you take whatever time you need for these medical appointments? I'll make sure it doesn't affect your pay." The relief that washed over Maria's face was worth every phone call, every careful orchestration, every moment of planning that had gone into making this possible. "Thank you, Mr. Smith. You don't know what this means to my family." But Will did know. He knew exactly what it meant, and for the first time in years he felt like his wealth was being used for something that truly mattered. The transformation began almost immediately, but it wasn't just Diego who was changing. It was Maria, and surprisingly it was Will himself. Within 2 weeks of Diego's first appointment with Dr. Hernandez, Maria's entire demeanor had shifted. She still worked with the same professional efficiency, but the desperate edge that Will now recognized had been there for years was finally beginning to soften. She hummed more often while she worked, and sometimes he caught her smiling to herself as she went about her daily tasks. The phone calls that had once sounded urgent and fearful became animated conversations filled with medical terminology that Maria was learning and hoped that she was finally allowing herself to feel. Will would hear fragments: physical therapy, new medications, Dr. Hernandez says, and each phrase felt like a small victory. Diego's response to proper medical care was remarkable. Dr. Hernandez had explained to Maria that children with cerebral palsy often showed dramatic improvement when they finally received comprehensive treatment, especially if they were as intelligent and determined as Diego clearly was. The new anti-seizure medications had reduced his episodes by nearly 80% within the first month. The physical therapy sessions were helping with muscle control and coordination. Most importantly, a new communication device was allowing Diego to express himself in ways that had been impossible before. Maria had shyly showed Will a video on her phone one evening, Diego using his new communication tablet to spell out, "I love you, Mama," for the first time in his life. Will had to excuse himself to his study, where he sat for 10 minutes, processing the emotional impact of witnessing a mother experience that kind of joy. But the changes weren't limited to Diego's medical progress. The home healthcare aide, who came 3 times a week, was allowing Maria to work without the constant anxiety about leaving her son alone. The medical transportation service meant she no longer had to navigate Los Angeles public transit while managing Diego's wheelchair and equipment. The new, properly fitted wheelchair and specialized bed meant Diego was more comfortable than he had ever been. Most remarkably, the financial pressure that had been crushing Maria for years was completely gone. For the first time since Diego's diagnosis, she wasn't choosing between rent and medication, between food and therapy sessions, between her son's needs and basic survival. Will watched these changes with a satisfaction that was different from any business success he had ever experienced. When a merger went well or a stock investment paid off, the pleasure was abstract, temporary. But seeing Maria's quiet joy, watching her move through his house without the weight of desperation she had carried for so long, this felt like something fundamental was being restored to the world. The most touching moment came about 6 weeks into Diego's treatment. Maria had been working in Will's home office, dusting the expensive art and organizing papers, when she paused at a family photograph on his desk, a picture of Will with his son Marcus at Marcus's high school graduation. "Your son is very handsome, Mr. Smith," she said softly. "You must be very proud of him." "I am," Will replied, looking up from his laptop. "Is that Diego in the photo on your phone?" It was the first time in 8 years that he had directly acknowledged her son's existence, and Maria's face lit up with surprised pleasure. "Yes, that's my Diego. He's 12 now, and he's been doing so much better lately. The doctors say he might even be able to go to school part-time soon. He looks like a strong boy," Will said, and he meant it. Even in the photo, Diego's eyes held an intelligence and determination that were unmistakable. "He is strong," Maria agreed, her voice filled with maternal pride. "Stronger than I ever gave him credit for. These new doctors, they see his potential in ways that no one else ever has." That conversation opened something between them, not friendship exactly, but a human recognition that had been absent for years. Maria began sharing small updates about Diego's progress, and Will found himself genuinely interested in hearing about physical therapy milestones and communication breakthroughs. But the most profound change was in Will himself. The elaborate deception he had orchestrated to help Diego had awakened something in him that had been dormant for years. He began noticing things he had never seen before. The homeless veteran who sat outside his office building, the single mother who worked at his local coffee shop, the elderly man who struggled with his groceries in the supermarket parking lot. Wealth, Will was learning, wasn't just about accumulating resources. It was about recognizing when those resources could change lives. And once you started seeing need, it became impossible to unsee it. He established the foundation for real, funding comprehensive care for 5 more children with special needs. He began volunteering at the community health center, where Michael Rodriguez worked. He started paying attention to the stories of struggle that were all around him, hidden in plain sight. But none of it compared to the simple pleasure of watching Maria discover that miracles could happen, that sometimes the universe did provide exactly what was needed most. She didn't know that the universe, in this case, was a man who had finally learned to see beyond the boundaries of his own comfortable world. 6 months after that first night, when Will had followed Maria home, he found her in his kitchen preparing lunch, humming the same Spanish lullaby he had heard that devastating morning when he realized how blind he had been. But now the melody carried joy instead of sorrow, hope instead of desperation. "That's a beautiful song, Maria," he said. "It's a lullaby my grandmother taught me," she replied, smiling. "I used to sing it to Diego when he was very small and couldn't sleep. Now I sing it because I'm happy." As Will watched Maria work, no longer desperate, no longer carrying impossible burdens alone, he understood that he had received the greater gift in this exchange. Maria had always been strong, loving, and resilient. But Will had learned something that no amount of money could have taught him. The difference between being rich and being truly wealthy lay not in what you possessed, but in what you gave away. 2 years later, Will Smith stood in the backyard of Maria's new house, a small but comfortable 3-bedroom home in a safe neighborhood, with ramps and medical equipment, accessible bathrooms, and a yard where Diego could sit in his wheelchair and feel the sun on his face. The house was another miracle that had come through the Foundation's housing assistance program naturally. Diego was sitting in his new advanced wheelchair, using his communication device to tell Will about his part-time enrollment at the local middle school, where he was thriving in a special needs program that challenged his sharp mind while accommodating his physical limitations. His seizures were well controlled now, his nutrition was optimal, and his physical therapy had improved his motor control significantly. But more than that, Diego was happy, truly, radiantly happy, in the way that only someone who has experienced both darkness and light can be. Maria was preparing a barbecue, their first in the new house, and Will had been invited as a family friend, which was what he had somehow become over the past 2 years. The elaborate deception had long since evolved into genuine relationship, though Maria still had no idea that her employer and her son's anonymous benefactor were the same person. "Mr. Smith," Diego said through his device, "my mama says you knew her before I got my new doctors. Thank you for being kind to her when things were hard." The simple statement hit Will with unexpected force. In Diego's mind, Will's only contribution had been basic human kindness to his mother during a difficult period. The boy had no idea he was thanking the person who had orchestrated his entire medical transformation. "Your mama is a very special person, Diego," Will replied. "She worked very hard to take care of you, and she never gave up hope." "I know," Diego responded, his eyes bright with intelligence and love. "She's the strongest person in the world." As Will watched Diego navigate his communication device with increasing skill, telling stories about his friends at school and his plans to join the debate team, he marveled at the transformation not just in the boy's circumstances, but in his possibilities. 2 years ago, Diego had been trapped in a 200-square-foot trailer, isolated and limited by lack of resources. Now he was a thriving student with friends, dreams, and a future full of potential. Maria appeared beside them, carrying a plate of food. "Diego, don't talk Mr. Smith's ear off," she said with maternal affection. "Actually, I love hearing about school," Will said. "Diego was just telling me about the debate team." "Oh, yes," Maria beamed. "The teachers say he has a real gift for argument. I can't imagine where he gets that from." Diego's electronic voice chimed with laughter, a sound that never failed to move Will, remembering the pain and struggle he had witnessed in that trailer 2 years ago. As the afternoon progressed, Will found himself thinking about the journey that had brought them all to this moment. The foundation he had established was now helping 12 families, with plans to expand further. The community health programs he supported were reaching hundreds of people. The scholarship fund he had created was sending kids like Diego to college, but none of those broader impacts compared to the simple pleasure of watching Maria relax completely for the first time since he had known her. She laughed easily now, played games with Diego, talked about her own dreams and plans in ways she never could when survival had been her only priority. "Mr. Smith," Maria said as the sun began to set, "I want to thank you again for being so understanding about my schedule these past 2 years. Not every employer would have been so flexible about medical appointments and therapy sessions. Maria, you've been with me for 10 years now. Your family comes first, always." "It's funny," she said, settling into a chair beside Diego's wheelchair. 2 years ago, I felt like I was drowning, like everything was impossible. And then suddenly everything changed. Diego got into that program, we got this house. His health improved so dramatically. Sometimes I think there must be angels watching over us." Will smiled, looking at Diego, who was using his device to contribute to a conversation about weekend plans with the complexity and enthusiasm of any 12-year-old. "Maybe there are," Will said quietly. That evening, as Will drove home to his Bel Air mansion, he reflected on how completely his definition of success had been rewritten. The business still thrived, the stock portfolio continued to grow, the luxury lifestyle continued unchanged in its material aspects, but none of that mattered the way it once had. What mattered was Diego's laughter echoing through Maria's backyard. What mattered was the thank you letter from another family whose child was now receiving proper medical care. What mattered was the knowledge that resources were being used to expand possibilities, rather than simply accumulating for their own sake. Will had learned that there were two kinds of wealth in the world: the kind that isolated you from human need, and the kind that connected you to opportunities to meet it. For the first 10 years of knowing Maria, he had possessed the first kind. Now, finally, he understood the value of the second. The next morning, Maria arrived at his house at 6 a.m. as she had for 10 years, but now she arrived from a home where her son was safe, healthy, and thriving. She arrived without the desperate edge that had once driven her every movement. She arrived as a woman whose burdens had been lightened not by luck or chance, but by the simple recognition that everyone deserves to have their struggles seen and their dignity preserved. As Will heard Maria begin her morning routine, humming that same Spanish lullaby that had once spoken of sorrow and now sang of joy, he understood that he had gained something worth more than any stock option or business deal he had ever negotiated. He had learned to see. And once you truly see the people around you, not just their function in your life, but their full humanity, their struggles, their dreams, their quiet heroism, you discover that the greatest privilege of wealth isn't what you can buy for yourself. It's what you can make possible for others. Will Smith had followed his housekeeper home 2 years ago and discovered a truth that shattered his heart. But in the rebuilding, he had found something infinitely more valuable than the comfortable ignorance he had lost. The knowledge that sometimes the most profound riches come not from what you accumulate, but from what you choose to give away. And in Maria's laughter, in Diego's bright future, in the dozens of other lives that had been touched by resources, finally used with consciousness and compassion, Will had found a kind of wealth that no market crash could diminish and no economic downturn could steal. He had learned finally what it truly meant to be rich. This story serves as a reminder that wealth means nothing without compassion, that proximity doesn't guarantee understanding, and that sometimes the most profound transformations begin with simply choosing to see the people who have been invisible to us all along. In a world where success is often measured by what we accumulate, perhaps true prosperity lies in what we choose to share.